Okay. So just checking the microphone. And then
Note, this write-up represents the state of our investigation.
cool, awesome. So, I found yesterday went well. I read these shallow articles, but this time I thought I would go jump to one of the medium depth reports on criminal justice reform. So yeah.
In a nutshell, what is the state of our investigation into U.S. criminal justice reform? We have completed our medium-depth investigation of criminal justice reform. The investigation has continued to progress and we have made some grants in this area. However, we have not yet chosen criminal justice reform, or any other cause, as a long-term program area. In order to learn substantially more from this investigation, we believe that we would need to commit to this cause for the medium term, i.e., several years. So we have paused this investigation until we are ready to select U.S. public policy causes for that level of commitment. Why are we making criminal justice reform grants? Criminal justice reform seems like a particularly promising area because we have identified a set of people who are promoting a particular viewpoint that is both appealing to us and appears underfunded, meaning that finding initial promising giving opportunities took less work in this area than we'd expect it would in many others, and b, as evidenced by a wave of reform packages in over 20 states and the recent confluence of conservative and progressive interest in reform. This issue seems to strongly stand out from most political issues in terms of political momentum and tractability. What is the problem? The United States incarcerates a larger proportion of its residents than almost any other country in the world and still has the highest level of criminal homicide in the developed world. Two while confounding factors impede rigorous analysis of incarceration's effect on the crime rate. It has been argued, and seems probably correct to us, that while initial increases in the incarceration rate may have reduced crime, a rate this high does not have large benefits for public safety and represents indiscriminate incarceration of offenders whether or not prison is the appropriate punishment. In particular, it seems plausible that the United States incarcerates too many low-risk offenders for too long. Incarceration has large fiscal costs. We believe that it also has large human and economic costs. Community corrections, such as probation and parole, which are one of the main alternatives to incarceration, may also need improvement, as evidenced by the 40% revocation rate for persons on probation. 3. What are possible interventions? Proposals for criminal justice reform can broadly be divided into two categories. Front-end reforms affect individuals at their first point of contact with the criminal justice system. Back-end reforms affect individuals after they have already entered the criminal justice system. Strategies to promote these reforms include policy research, legislative advocacy, technical assistance to policymakers or practitioners, litigation, communication and public education, direct services, and pilot projects. Criminal justice reform is a broad field and we have so far focused on the particular set of interventions that initially got us interested in this cause. Interventions that broadly seek to reduce incarceration while having neutral or even positive effects on public safety by focusing prison beds on high-risk offenders and improving community corrections, such as probation and parole, so that offenders for whom prison is not necessary are adequately supervised. Who else is working on it? Several foundations in the United States federal government are working on various aspects of criminal justice reform. Our perception is that organizations can roughly be divided into those that frame reform in terms of the rights of defendants and people in prison, and organizations making a case that focuses on improving public safety and reducing public spending on incarceration by saving jail and prison beds for high-risk offenders, and thus seeks to appeal to conservatives as well as progressives. How much of an impact could we have? We are very uncertain about how big of a humanitarian impact we could expect for a given level of funding for criminal justice reform. Based on claims in states that have already adopted reform packages, we would guess that reducing prison populations by about 10% while having a neutral or slightly positive impact on public safety could be a reasonable near-term goalpost. In the longer term, we guess that much larger reductions might be possible if community corrections are strengthened and the political dialogue around criminal justice policy continues to improve.
Awesome. Okay, so two. Front-end reforms.
We initially became interested in criminal justice reform because policy generalists we spoke with during our broad exploration of U.S. politics and policy advocacy indicated to us that it was an unusually promising, and in particular, unusually tractable, cause. For specifically, we heard from multiple sources that the combination of the adverse U.S. fiscal situation, declining crime rates, and emerging conservative interest in an issue historically supported by progressives may have created a unique moment for criminal justice reform with a limited window. 5. Upon investigation, we learned that more than 24 states, supported by the Pew Charitable Trust's Public Safety Performance Project, PSPP, and the federal government's Bureau of Justice Assistance, have passed criminal justice reform legislative packages since 2007. 6. We are unaware of any equally important U.S. public policy cause that can match this extensive wave of reforms, nor of any other policy organization deeply involved in so much recent legislation, which reinforced our view that criminal justice reform stands out for its political momentum. The strong possibility of observing substantial policy change in the short term, combined with the possibility to work in multiple states, suggested that criminal justice reform might be a particularly good opportunity to learn about policy advocacy. Criminal justice reform also stands out because we quickly identified a set of innovative ideas that seemed potentially high impact and underfunded, and b. a set of researchers, specialists, and technical assistance providers ready to promote these ideas with additional funding. In particular, we learned about certain proposals such as making responses to offenses more swift and certain, improving community corrections for example by using electronic monitoring or improved risk assessment, designing regulations for cannabis in Washington and Colorado, where recreational use is now legal according to state law, and reducing the prevalence of binge drinking and alcohol use disorders that aim to reduce incarceration with a neutral or positive effect on public safety. Mark Kleiman, Moore, and Angela Hawken, Moore, are academics who work on these types of policies, and we believe each could expand their work with more funding. Back to top. The problem. The United States is burdened both by a very high incarceration rate and by a high, but declining, crime rate. In 2012, there were about 1.5 million Americans in prison and 750,000 in jails, for a total of about 2.2 million incarcerated Americans. 7. The United States incarcerates more residents as a proportion of its population than almost any other country in the world. 8. The incarceration rate is not necessarily driven entirely by criminal justice policy. However, the United States may also have more crime than other developed countries. The U.S. homicide rate is more than twice as high as the OECD average of 2.23 homicides per 100,000 people. 9. Graph of crime and incarceration. A larger version of this graph is available here, as shown by the above figure. Since the 1990s, violent crime in the United States has fallen dramatically while incarceration rates have continued to increase. 10. Rising incarceration rates in the context of falling crime could be taken to suggest that the U.S. incarcerates too many residents, but it is also possible that increased incarceration contributed to declining crime by incapacitating those most likely to commit crimes. Criminologists have attempted to disentangle these factors, but confounding factors impede rigorous analysis, and we have not seen good studies nailing down the high incarceration rate's effect on crime. 11. Still, it has been argued, and seems probably correct, to us that, while initial increases in incarceration may have reduced crime, at the current margin, higher incarceration does not have large benefits for public safety. 12. In particular, we guess that sentences in the United States are too long and too inconsistently applied, and that strong community supervision, combined with the threat of short stints in jail, is not adequately used as an alternative to incarceration for low.
Okay, I'm gonna check this one out.
Our risk offenders. We have not attempted to carefully quantify the costs of the high incarceration rate, but we believe those costs to be quite high along many dimensions. The fiscal costs to states and the federal government. 13. The suffering of people who are incarcerated. The economic costs of lost earnings by those prisoners who would have been employed had they not been incarcerated. 14. Economic costs to decreased earnings by ex-offenders after they are released from prison. 15. The cost to the families and communities of those who are incarcerated. As of 2010, 2.7 million minor children had a parent behind bars, potentially leading to a host of problems. 16. Additionally, as of 2007, 1 in 9 young black men was behind bars. 17. We'd guess that high incarceration rates might have particularly negative effects in communities where incarceration has become a normative experience, potentially impacting family formation. The costs of crime may also be concentrated in black communities. 18. Back to top. Possible interventions. Many criminal justice reforms fall into one of two categories. Front-end reforms affect individuals at their first point of contact with the criminal justice system. Back-end reforms affect individuals after they have already entered the criminal justice system. Some examples of front-end reforms include reducing or improving the use of pretrial detention, increase
So decrease in
increasing the use of alternatives to incarceration, decriminalizing some activities, such as the possession or sale of drugs, improving the quality of legal representation for criminal defendants, changing policing policies, and shortening sentences. Some examples of back-end reforms include increasing eligibility for parole, minimizing the frequency or severity of probation and parole revocations, for example by increasing the swiftness and certainty of responses, and improving community corrections to try to minimize recidivism. Additionally, improving prison conditions may reduce the suffering of those in prison, and some policy reforms outside of the criminal justice system, such as reducing lead exposure or fetal alcohol exposure, may be able to reduce crime. We have not deeply vetted the entire range of policy changes proposed by criminal justice advocates and do not have a firm position on which reforms are most beneficial. That said, because we believe that crime and incarceration both have high costs, we are most enthusiastic about reforms that seem to reduce incarceration while improving, or at least maintaining, public safety. Back to top. Ideas promoted by Mark Kleiman. Mark Kleiman is a researcher who studies and promotes approaches to crime control with the potential to simultaneously
I notice I'm not talking as much this time as last time, and I'm in a different sitting position, and I'm thinking maybe that is making it slightly less comfortable to talk, or I'm not even sure if my voice is actually being picked up. One sec. Oh, okay, how about that?
Mark Kleiman is a researcher who studies and promotes approaches to crime control with the potential to simultaneously reduce crime and incarceration. 19. Dr. Kleiman also worked as a consultant to advise the state of Washington on implementing the legalization of recreational cannabis. 20. We think that a set of reforms propounded by Dr. Kleiman, some of which have been studied by Angela Hawken, seem particularly promising. These reforms include swift and certain sanctions exemplified by Hawaii's Opportunity, probation with enforcement, HOPE program. Mark Kleiman, Angela Hawken, and other criminal justice specialists believe that misbehavior can be deterred more strongly with less punishment if punishment is distributed more consistently and closer to the time the offender misbehaves. 21. The current criminal justice system, particularly the probation and parole systems, attempts to use harsh punishments to make up for the inconsistency of enforcement. Advocates of swift and certain sentences believe this approach is ill-suited to human psychology, and particularly to the psychology of those most likely to commit crimes, who are likely to have trouble with long-term planning. The last 15 years of a 20-year sentence, these advocates believe, have very high cost but very low additional deterrent effect. 22. Swift and certain sanctions aim to improve the efficiency of the criminal justice system and to decrease crime with less punishment. In HOPE, Hawaii Judge Stephen Alm implemented a version of swift and certain sanctions by frequently, yet randomly, drug testing probationers and, instead of revoking those who failed from probation altogether, sentencing them immediately to a jail stay of a few days. 23. Initial evidence from a randomized controlled trial of HOPE, which we have not vetted, was very positive, though some have expressed uncertainty about whether the program is replicable and whether its effects will be sustained over the long run. 24. Studies of other programs implementing swift and certain sanctions may have also shown promising results. 25. Dr. Kleiman believes that, despite the initial success of HOPE and other programs, there is a lack of funding for research on an implementation of swift and certain sanctions. 26. GPS position monitoring. GPS position monitoring has the potential to reduce both crime and incarceration by enabling law enforcement to closely supervise offenders without putting them behind bars. 27. For under $5 a day, offenders could be given tamper-evident ankle monitors so that it would be immediately evident to their supervisors if they were the location of a crime. 28. This technology might enable some prisoners to be more quickly released back into the community, or to avoid incarceration altogether, without risking public safety. The large number of crimes currently committed by those on probation or parole might also be reduced by this technology. 29. Lastly, in addition to its potential to improve the quality of supervision, precision, monitoring also opens up the possibility of graduated punishments, such as curfews, that are less severe and have fewer collateral consequences than incarceration, but that might still deter or incapacitate many offenders. 30. However, Mark Kleiman stated to us that GPS position monitoring has not yet been subject to much testing and has a very bad reputation among practitioners because of its use for actively monitoring sex offenders. 31.
See, that's really unfortunate, because I think GPS position monitoring is really promising, especially in the graduated punishments such as curfews and house arrests.
Several communities on edge after a convicted murderer escapes his GPS ankle monitor.
But as Team 12's William Pitts verified, that's not as easy as you may think.
An ankle monitor is supposed to keep you confined to a certain space, and you'd think it would be impossible to get it off. That way, wherever the bracelet is, that's where the offender is, but that's not always the case. We wanted to verify how easy is it really to cut one off.
Police say convicted murderer Naomis Winfrey cut off his ankle monitor and took off. He was out on parole after serving 25 years.
These are what we call the bad boy cuffs.
It's not impossible to remove an ankle bracelet from GPS monitoring solutions, but Lisa Penny says it'll take a lot.
We've had people try to use blowtorches. Of course, they were picked up in the ER.
First try.
Their staff has even tried heavy bolt cutters. It didn't work either.
Okay. That hurt.
Plus, as soon as you try to mess with it, they get a notice.
As soon as that bolt cutter grabs onto this actual cuff, we will get an immediate text.
The ankle monitor also has an alarm, speaker, and microphone. They can talk to the offender and track them within a few feet. But Penny says the bad boy cuff is not what most courts use. It's expensive. The thin rubber cuffs are much cheaper.
That's what most probation and pretrial offices use. And a pair of kitchen scissors will actually cut that right in half.
Penny says they've put bracelets on more than 7,000 people. Only 37 have gotten out of them, and the company knew within seconds.
So is it easy to cut off an ankle monitor? Depending on the kind, yes, it can be very easy. But since most services are notified immediately once they're cut off, the tricky part is escaping afterward.
Hi everybody, glad you're with us tonight. I'm Darren Kramer.
And I'm Ann Craig. We hear about it all the time.
Yeah, okay, so this is another issue, is that I think some people, maybe on the left, are not excited and think that, that there are downsides to ankle monitors. And I think that's true, right? So, like, people needing to charge like this. But I think it's better than being in prison, right? Like, just think about it yourself. Like, would you rather be in prison or have an ankle monitor? If the choice was between the two, like, how much would you pay to wear an ankle monitor instead of being in prison?
Offenders, 31. Drug policy reforms with potential to reduce abuse and...
But that's really, yeah.
Incarceration. Regulating cannabis in Washington state and Colorado. Dr. Kleiman believes that the cannabis markets in Washington state and Colorado will end up promoting themselves to heavy users like the alcohol market as unless advocacy and technical assistance to state governments led to responsible regulation. 32. Dr. Kleiman was part of a group that worked with Washington state on its implementation of cannabis legalization and has suggested multiple ways to try to limit the costs of legalization and decrease marketing to abusers. 33. Reducing the prevalence of binge drinking and alcohol use disorders. Dr. Kleiman told us that alcohol abuse is the most important public policy issue that he can think of that has no major advocate at the moment. 34. According to Dr. Kleiman, reducing binge drinking by, for example, raising the alcohol tax or prohibiting drinking among past abusers would lower crime and have an immediate effect on the homicide rate. 35. However, increasing regulation of alcohol could be politically difficult. 36. The Pew Public Safety Performance Project, PSPP, supports various evidence-based corrections and sentencing reforms intended to help states maximize the return on their public safety spending. These reforms include risk and needs assessments of offenders to improve decisions about detention, incarceration, release, supervision, and treatment, accountability measures to ensure the use of evidence-based practices, and or develop data reporting requirements, good time and earned time credits that reduce the sentences or length of community supervision for inmates who behave well in prison or participate in programs designed to reduce recidivism, intermediate and graduated sanctions, often based on hope, to deter bad behavior, increased funding for community-based treatments such as substance abuse programs and reentry plans, sentencing changes, mandatory supervision requirements to ensure that high-risk offenders are supervised after being released from prison, problem-solving courts, which are often focused on offenders with substance abuse or mental health disorders, streamlined and expanded parole to reduce incarceration while protecting public safety by expanding post-release supervision. 37. While these are among the most common reforms, the specific reforms in each state are tailored to each state's needs. PSPP's population impact projections in the participating states estimate that these types of reforms can reduce state prison populations by 5% to 25%. 38. We hope to discuss these reforms in more detail in an upcoming write-up. Steve Tellis is a political scientist at Johns Hopkins who has written about philanthropy's role in political movements and in policy advocacy. Professor Tellis is the only person we've come across who has extensively studied the historical role of philanthropy in politics, and seems to have a broad view of the different ways in which philanthropy can influence policy. We have hired Dr. Tellis part-time as a consultant, and his work for us on criminal justice reform has informed many parts of our investigation. Dr. Tellis believes that with vastly intensified community corrections and alternatives to incarceration in place, incarceration rates could be safely reduced by up to 50%. To do this, we would need to substantially expand the advocacy infrastructure around criminal justice reform and might need to move beyond the specific interventions listed above. 39. Various political and advocacy strategies, including policy research, legislative advocacy, technical assistance to policymakers or practitioners, litigation, communications, and public education, funding direct services, and funding pilot projects could be used to pursue these policies. We are still learning about what might be the most fruitful strategies for achieving promising reforms. Two tactics that have struck us as particularly promising are providing technical assistance to state policymakers through the justice reinvestment process and engaging conservatives advocating reform. PSPP uses both these tactics, and we plan to elaborate in a future write-up. We also believe that building an infrastructure to advocate for swift and certain responses to offenses and to provide technical assistance to policymakers and practitioners interested in those principles might be particularly effective. Our grants to Mark Kleiman, Moore, and Angela Hawken, Moore, are, in part, intended to provide tools to practitioners implementing or evaluating swift and certain sanctions.
Which drugs should be legal? How legal should they be?
Indeed, Professor Kleiman is a fitting speaker.
Of using. And then every round,
Oh my god.
possibly make that work.
I love
If
this.
the problem is that too many people are breaking the rule, so you can't punish all of them, saying that the solution is to punish all of them is like the famous economist stranded on the desert island. Lots of tinned food, but no can opener. Right? What does the economist do in that circumstance? He assumes a can opener. So let me show you that I'm not just assuming a can opener. is a little simulation program. Imagine that each of these squares is a person. The color designates his propensity to break some rules. So imagine these are 100 probationers on some probation officer's caseload, and the color is their likelihood of using cocaine this month. Thank you very much. All the numbers. There we are. So that person is very likely to use, that person is not very likely to use. And at the beginning, we got a random draw, but we got 51%, the average probability of using. And then every round, at random, but according to the probability, each person either breaks the rule
How much of an impact could we have? We are very uncertain about how much additional policy change various levels of funding might lead to in this space, the magnitude of prison population reduction that would be achieved by various policy changes, and the effects various policy changes might have on other variables such as the crime rate or the economy. We are also very uncertain about how much we should value reductions in prison time served relative to other potential outcomes, for example, additional income, or years of life, or the ability to migrate from a developing country to a rich country. We have, however, done back-of-the-envelope calculations to get a sense of whether plausible near-term reforms would be important enough to justify our investment in this area. We do not yet know how ambitious our longer-term goals might be were we to invest in this area over multiple years. Justice Reinvestment. Justice Reinvestment is a partnership through which PSPP and the federal government's Bureau of Justice Assistance provide technical assistance to states so that they can improve the efficiency and reduce the costs of the criminal justice system and then use those cost savings to fund evidence-based public safety practices, improving the overall state budget. 58 Much of the criminal justice legislation passed since 2007 came out of the Justice Reinvestment process. Specifically, through 2013, 29 legislative reform packages had been passed in 27 states through Justice Reinvestment. 59. On average, PSPP forecasts that in the states in which it has worked, prison populations will fall about 11% in the 5 years after reform relative to what would have happened in reform's absence. We hope to give our assessment of these forecasts in a future write-up focused on PSPP. Justice Reinvestment's track record suggests to us that a 10% further reduction in incarceration is ambitious but not infeasible. For an in-depth overview of Justice Reinvestment, please see the Urban Institute's assessment here. Our own full review of PSPP, including its Justice Reinvestment work, is near completion and should be published shortly. Scaling swift and certain responses, exemplified by HOPE. As discussed above, HOPE is a program in which particularly high-risk probationers are transferred from normal probation into a swift and certain sanctions regime, in which they are subjected to randomly scheduled drug tests and immediately given brief jail stays for each probation violation. 60. The randomized controlled trial of HOPE, which was restricted to drug-involved probationers who were not on supervision for domestic violence or sex offenses, estimated that the average time spent in prison per probationer was reduced from about 134 days behind bars to about 69 days, an average difference of 65 days. 61 In addition, no-shows for probation appointments, positive urine tests,